Hey, good morning. Robert Mitchell here. If you're new to my channel, I am an author, a martial artist, and a seminarian, and I'm a deacon in the old Catholic tradition. So today's Sunday message, I'm going to show you some atheists rediscovering Christianity. And it just keeps happening. And I think it's happening more and more these days. I think it's happening because we've spent probably 100 years or two maybe piling stuff on top of Christianity and covering it up in dust and rubble and debris as we've tried to tear down the project. And then what's happening is that more and more prominent scientists are rediscovering it, and they don't even realize it. So we're going to start with this little clip, and this is Brett Weinstein, who had some public debates with Richard Dawkins of the God Delusion fame. And Brett is an atheist, but he's an evolutionary biologist. And so here's a few words from Brett Weinstein. You can, if you're a Christian, you can appreciate that he's rediscovering Christianity from a different side. It's like he's digging up a pyramid and finding one stone, and he's beginning to see something here. So listen to this. And if you're an atheist, and look, I'm not shy about my project. I want to convert atheists to Christianity. What else is there for someone who's in the clergy? So listen to this.
On stage, I told Dawkins that religions that have existed for thousands of years cannot be mind viruses, but that new atheism can. And I really believe this. New atheism is novel. It has not stood the test of time, and in fact, it creates a problem for many of us who might otherwise be willing to be called atheists, because it has taken on an ideological fervor, rather than being an argument that there is no supernatural explanation for the phenomena that we find within the universe. It has become a challenge to people who view the universe otherwise. And that desire to challenge people rather than to challenge ideas is not helpful. Even if new atheism began in a productive direction, it became so focused in doing battle on behalf of an idea that I think it just lost its way, and it ceased to be able to see that it had gone too far. That in fact, it is one thing to point out that religious traditions are not literal. It is another thing to argue that they are error, because that's not what they are. They are much more than error.
What's your definition of them? I mean, I've heard you say before that they are metaphorically true but literally false.
My argument has been that religions are compendiums of a kind of wisdom, but that wisdom is non-literal. So that when we evaluate the content of, let's say, a biblical text, if we look at it with respect to did these events occur, then we will dismiss it. If we say, what would the effect on an individual be of believing that these events had occurred, the effect would be positive from the point of view of their genetic fitness. That is to say, how well they are able to serve their genetic interests would be enhanced by believing in these structures. So, for example, if one behaves in life in such a way as to make it more likely that one will go to heaven and make it less likely that one will end up in hell, it just so happens that behaving in that honorable way will cause your descendants to be well positioned in society, to be well thought of, to be treated well. Whereas if you betray people and act like a jerk, it's very likely that your descendants will experience a cost for your untrustworthiness. So it is no accident, I am arguing, that behaving so as to get you into heaven does not actually get you into a place called heaven, but it does.
Really? It doesn't?
Get you into an analogous place in which your descendants are better off after your death. Their life is better after your death. It's a kind of life after death, but it's not literal. So guys like Dawkins are unable to see this kind of value, that is to say, a pragmatic value of these belief systems, because they are too caught up in evaluating the claims that are tied up in these texts. So, in effect, they're missing the forest for the trees, because the falseness of the literal claim obscures the value of belief in that claim.
What effect has that had on evolutionary biology, for example?
Evolutionary biology has been stuck. In my opinion, it has been stuck since about 1976, which is the year that Dawkins published The Selfish Gene as a 35-year-old young gun.
So here's the question I would have for Brett if I met Brett. If it works, then it's true. So you can't dismiss the truth of the claims of the Christian religion out of hand and just say, well, it's not really true, it's just practically true. If it's true and it gives the results, then isn't that true? I don't know. But anyway, so, but let's move on now to another one. And this is Tom Holland. Tom Holland, of course, is a historian. He's another atheist. And he's another atheist who has discovered Christianity. And so he was a devoted classicist, and he studied Rome, and he wrote Rubicon, and so forth and so on. And with his most recent book, Dominion, he explains how Christianity transformed the world and is at the core of Western civilization. And so let's listen to Tom Holland talking about the rediscovery of Christianity.
But it changes you in ways that you may not appreciate.
When he says he's referring to Christianity. It changes you in ways you can't appreciate.
And just quickly sketch out why that central idea, you say this in the book, is so important. You say the belief that the Son of the one God of the Jews had been tortured to death on a cross became so enduringly and widely held that today most of us in the West are dulled to just how scandalous it originally was. Why is that image so important at the centre of Christianity? Well, the cross today is probably the most internationally recognisable cultural symbol that humanity has ever devised. But the symbolism of it has been turned on its head. What the cross symbolised for Rome, and for those who were subject to Rome, was the power of the greatest empire on the face of the earth to torture to death anyone who opposed its rule. And governors of Roman provinces had the right to burn rebels, to throw them to the lions, or to crucify them. And of these three faiths, crucifixion was regarded as the worst, as in a sense being the archetypal punishment for a rebellious slave. And the reason that it was so horrible was it was physically excruciating. There was no one way of doing a crucifixion. You could be hung upside down, you could be impaled, or you could have nails smashed through your bones, and to stay alive on a cross you would have to pull yourself up and down, so you would feel the metal scraping against your bone the whole time. Birds would flock around your head, you'd be unable to beat them away, you'd be unable to stop them as they pecked out your eyes, you would be naked, and so hours, perhaps days of excruciating agony would be endured. But worse than that, from the kind of the Roman point of view, it would be public. You would be a kind of billboard advertising your own humiliation and the power of the authorities that were putting you to death. And so the idea that this symbol of all symbols should, in a sense, have kind of been upended, that from degradation, the notion of triumph, from humiliation, glory, from death, life, and that more than that, the idea that someone who suffers the death of a slave emerges to become, it turns out to be, in a sense, the creator of all heaven and earth and of all humanity. What that means in the long run is that it gives a dignity to
people who previously would not have been afforded dignity by anyone. It embeds at the heart of the West the idea that the victim can triumph over the person who is victimizing him, and that the lowest of the low might in a sense be the highest. And these, in the context of certainly of Roman culture, it's hard to emphasize just how radical a concept that is. And therefore, just how much of a kind of a detonation it is under the assumptions of Roman power. And the measure of how vast that explosion was is that now, by and large, we tend to take for granted that, you know, the lowest of the low do have a dignity. Mm.
So you hear Tom Holland keep saying, in a sense. It's those of us who are Christian don't think that it's true in a sense. We think it's actually literally true. But you can see here Tom Holland, again, you know, like the blind man in the room with an elephant. He feels the trunk, and he sees something's here that he is recognizing, and he's rediscovering this like an archaeologist. Now this last bit here, this is a section of a debate between Jordan Peterson, who's a public intellectual, author of 12 Rules for Life, New York Times bestselling author. He's been at the center of a number of free speech debates, and he's a psychologist of some renown, discussing with Sam Harris, the new atheist, explaining to Sam Harris how Sam Harris is trying to, in a sense, there I go using Tom Holland's expression, how Sam Harris is basically trying to construct morality without religion. So listen to this one.
I do believe you do that in your work, because
Right.
basically what you suggest is that the appropriate way to act ethically is to act in a manner that moves us away from hell and moves us towards a desirable state. Now, the thing is that as far as I'm concerned, there's a couple of things about that. The first thing is that I wouldn't say that mode of acting is a fact. I would say it's a personality, and that what you're suggesting is that people embody the personality that moves society away from hell towards heaven, for lack of a better term. And the reason I make that argument is because I think that you recapitulate the essential Christian message precisely by doing that, because symbolically speaking, at least as far as I can understand, stripped of its of its metaphysical context, let's say, the purpose of positing the vision of the ideal human being, which, independent of the metaphysical context, it's certainly what the symbol of Christ represents, is the mode of being that moves us most effectively from something approximating hell to something approximating heaven. And then part of that message is, and this is also something that's dead along the lines of what you're arguing, is that the best way to embody that is actually to live in truth. I mean, because I would say that the fundamental Christian ethic, metaphysics accepted once again, is to act in love, which is to assume that being is acceptable and can be perfected, and to pursue that with truth, and that you should embody that. And then I would say that the purpose of the representation, we could call them metafictions or archetypal representations, is to show that is in embodied format so that it can be imitated, rather than to transform it into something that's diluted in some sense to an abstract rationality. Because I don't think the abstract rationality in itself has enough flesh on it, so to speak, which is partly why in the Christian ethic there's an emphasis that the word, which is something roughly akin to rationality, has to be made flesh. It has to be enacted.
But is the flesh made of dogmatism and superstition and otherworldliness? Is that part of what gives it its shape and necessity? I think traditionally, historically, it has been, and that's been the problem with religion.
I still don't understand why Sam Harris doesn't understand that the absence of religion is what causes death, not its presence.
if you denude it of everything that is unjustifiable in the light of 21st century science and rationality, I think what you have to get down to is something quite a bit more universal and less provincial than any specific religion, much less Christianity per se.
Well, it's interesting too, though, that one of the points that you do make is that you do appeal to or assume the existence of a transcendental internal ethics, something like that, which I would say, by the way, just since we're going down this direction, seems to me to be something very akin to the idea of the Holy Spirit, which is something like the internal representation of a transcendent universal ethic. Now remember, I'm trying to strip these concepts of their metaphysical substrate. I'm not making a case at the moment for the existence of the great man in the sky. We can get to that later. I'm saying that what seems to be the case is that we have underneath our cognitive architecture and our social architecture a layer of symbolic and dramatic and narrative representation that instantiates the same concepts, but in a multi-dimensional context. One of the things we talked about in Vancouver, for example, is that the religious enterprise doesn't only emphasize rationality. It brings music into the play, and it brings art into the play, and it brings drama, and it brings literature, and it brings architecture, and it brings the organizing of cities around a central space. Like it's pushing itself, it's manifesting itself across multiple dimensions of human existence simultaneously. And to me, that gives it a richness that cannot be diluted without loss, and also a motive power that a pure appeal to rationality I don't think can manage. And this is one of the things, this is maybe a good place for Douglas to leap in. One of the things that Douglas, who's claimed upon multiple occasions to be an atheist, and I don't know how he's feeling about that at the present time, but it doesn't matter. One of the things Douglas has pointed out was that there are things that we've done in free countries, let's say, broadly speaking, in the West, that are worth protecting, and that in order to protect them in the longest sense, it's conceivable that we need a cognitive structure, something like that, that can act as a bulwark against those forces that would seek to undermine and destroy it. And Douglas has been driven, I would say, to some degree, to hypothesize that for Christianity, for all its faults, or we could say Judeo-Christianity to broaden it, for all its faults, might provide something approximating that bulwark if we could only figure out how to utilize it properly. So,
yes.
So once again, we have a couple of atheists rediscovering religion, seeing the value of the project, but not wanting to take the final step, which is to admit that it's actually real. And real in the sense that any possible sense that you can imagine real meaning. So I want to now sum this up with a piece here. This is Bishop Robert Barron talking about why he liked Christopher Hitchens and how Christopher Hitchens was also an atheist, a famous one, who stood on the substrate of Christianity and didn't even know it. And this to me may be the most brilliant thing I've ever heard anyone say. Certainly one of the most brilliant things I've ever heard anyone say.
Now, here's the main reason, though, why I like Christopher Hitchens. All of that's just kind of preliminary. The main reason was because of his deep religiosity. And now, I realize that requires a little bit of explanation. And I'll begin with what I think was Hitchens' great mistake when it comes to God. I've done other videos about this, so you might look at those for more detail, but like Dawkins and Sam Harris and many others, Hitchens consistently misconstrued what serious religious people mean when they say God. Time and again, Christopher Hitchens, and now his millions of disciples, I hear from them almost every day, refer to God as, a sky fairy, your invisible friend, the flying spaghetti monster, meaning some crazy mythological fantasy for which there's absolutely no evidence. They would also excoriate, Hitchens did it all the time, excoriate religious people for what they call the God of the gaps. You know, that there's a gap in our present scientific explanation, so let's put God in there. And then as science advances, God retreats to ever smaller gaps in the explanatory system. So over and over again you hear that criticism from Hitchens. I mean, here's the thing. All of that is wide of the mark. All of that misses what we mean when we say God. God is not a being in the world. The creator of the entire universe is not ingredient in the universe, is not an item among many within the universe. God is not some reality for which there may or may not be evidence. You know, is there a moon around Jupiter? Well, or moons around Jupiter, let's check and see. There are or there aren't. See, God isn't like that, some being in the world. Thomas Aquinas made the decisive distinction when he said God is not en summum, highest being, but ipsum esse, the sheer act of to be itself. God is the reason why there's something rather than nothing. God is the reason why there is the nexus of condition causality at all. And see, what it means is God is not a true thing, but the truth itself. God's not a good thing among many. God is goodness itself. God is not one just state of affairs. God is justice itself. And see, once we get this clear, we can see what I mean when I say Christopher Hitchens is profound, or was profoundly religious. Something you see now, book after book, essay after essay, speech after speech. Christopher Hitchens was passionate for justice. Go back to his earliest book on Greece and Cyprus, as he advocates the position of the oppressed. Look at his writings on Palestine. Look at his writings on Salman Rushdie. Look at his writings on the Iraq War. Whatever it was this deep and abiding passion to set things right. He was a profoundly moral man, I would say, even moralizing, intense sense of what's right and what's just. And here's the point. That is the sign that someone has been grasped by the unconditioned just. See, think about this for a second. If there's no God at all, there's no God, we're just dumbly here by vague chance. The universe it just spins along in utter indifference to human cruelty, human nobility. One day, this whole earth will just be incinerated. All of us just live for a short time and then we fade away. If that's the case, truly, why would you care about justice? Why would you care, ultimately? Wouldn't, in fact, Dostoevsky be right in saying, if there is no God, then anything is permitted? Those who burn with a passion for justice, I would argue, have a keen sense of an absolute, unconditioned criterion of justice, which I would call God. The unconditioned just is what we mean by God. And see, I saw that on display in practically everything that Christopher Hitchens wrote. He was battling sky fairies and flying spaghetti monsters. Fine, I'd battle those too. He claims there's no evidence for some mythological supreme being. I agree with him. But see, what I caught behind his rhetoric always was this passion for God, not to put too fine a point on it. Just a last observation. It was right after his cancer diagnosis became public. I did a piece for the CNN blog, and I urged my fellow Christians to pray for Christopher Hitchens. Is he the enemy of religion? Yes, I said, but we should love our enemies, He's a fellow human being, and we should pray for him. Okay. I thought it was a very benign article. It was met with this avalanche of negative commentary. Thousands of people telling me, to lay off of Christopher Hitchens and not to cover him up with my medieval mumbo-jumbo and keep your prayers to yourself, etc., etc. Well, I can happily say I didn't agree with any of that. I didn't follow it. I did pray for Christopher Hitchens all during his illness. When I heard of his death, I was saddened, and I prayed for him that day and have continued to. I'm praying for him not just as someone I admired as a writer, but someone who I think was, despite himself, a religious man.
So, to my atheist viewers and to my atheist friends, I hope you enjoyed this video, and to my Christian friends too. So hopefully you found this message beneficial. My point in doing this is only to let you know that you may be standing on something of incredible value that you don't even realize you're standing on. And don't take it for granted. If you've lost it, dig it up and embrace it. Take care.